Tonight on Black Health Now, so you want to be a nurse. What are the benefits of sleeping naked? Does your race matter to science? What's wrong when you start to lose memories? And finally, treating ADHD without medication. All that and more on Black Health Now with Doc and Dean.
Black Health Now, your weekly check-in on how your family can get and stay healthy. Joined by experts from around the world, here are Dr. Mike Lenore and Ellis Dean.
Thank you for joining us. I am Ellis Dean, the Director of Programming and Production at blackdoctor.org. And this show is called Doc and Dean. And so we got to bring on the man of the hour, the past NMA president, as well as the asthma and allergy specialist known as Dr. Michael Lenore. How are you doing, Dr. Lenore?
I'm doing pretty well today. I finished a whole weekend of celebrations of my daughter's marriage, and we got that all done. And I got a chance to use the steps my choreographer told me to use 2 years ago. I think that stuff is still in style, but I'm feeling good. We start out with a little bit of discussion about COVID. I know people are tired about that, but everybody's warning the fact that we don't do something over the next several months. This winter could be pretty barbaric. There's a new variant kind of lingering around, I think called the Q1 variant, and obviously there are going to be different variants. It's clear that vaccinations make a big difference, so we're not going to continue to browbeat you about vaccinations. You know the advantages and disadvantages, but it's estimated that if we don't turn this around by January 2023, we'll be looking at 16,000 cases a day and almost 300 or 400 deaths. So remember, things are still the same. The other thing they're showing is that the long haulers situation lasts now maybe for 18 months. And so that, for instance, a lot of people are incapacitated with that. So the message is that let's just kind of terminate it with that. Get vaccinated.
I mean, it really is. It seems more, simple for folks. It's really all about, taking the precautionary measures, and those precautionary measures. If you're not gonna, I don't see many people wearing masks anymore. I see more and more people in large gatherings of folks without masks on. So if you're going to go out there and take those risks, which is still going out in today's society, you're taking a risk by doing that. If you're going to take those risks, do something that can be protective. So even if you do catch COVID, it can reduce the deleterious effects of it, and that is by getting vaccinated. I think that's something very simple. It takes less than 5 minutes.
We need to come up with some kind of slogan like, if you want to last, get the mask. Something like that. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to come up with something.
We got to hear first. So we got to make sure if anybody takes that, we got to
you want to go on the scene, get the vaccine. But we got to get something that goes well. Well, let's move into some more serious issues. I think they're serious. Alice, you've been doing some research on the advantages of sleeping naked. So let's see what you have to say, and let's see what I have to say on the other side.
Well, I had to do a double take when I saw this, right? And so really there are about 4 health benefits for sleeping naked, or naked, as we say in our community. So we like to put the E and the 2 Ks in there. We say sleeping naked. So there are 4 health benefits to sleeping naked. And so number 1 is you get a better quality of sleep. And why is that? Why do you get a better quality of sleep? Well, we know that when we go to sleep, our temperature, there's chemicals that get released into our body, our temperature tends to drop. But when we put on clothes and we have all those blankets, when our temperature goes, it keeps our temperature up. And so therefore that can disrupt our sleep, causing more insomnia and other problems in terms of disturbing our sleep. And so when you're sleeping naked, your temperature can lower to a proper amount, and you can get a better quality of sleep. The second thing that can happen from sleeping naked is you can reduce your belly size. Yes, you can reduce your belly size in terms of like that same process of your the chemicals they are releasing in your body when you're sleeping and your temperature coming down. We can reduce those cortisol. And when we have cortisol, we know that that's that bad hormone that gets released that increases our belly size. They can add to that waist circumference. That's a bad indicator of being obese or overweight. But when we lower that body temperature, we lower the amount of cortisol that gets released into our bloodstream, and therefore we can reduce that belly size. The third thing that can happen is you can have more sex. And what's wrong with that? You can have more sex if you're sleeping naked. If you've got a partner, somebody there with you that's also naked, two people naked cuddling, and research has shown that having sex once or twice a week can also reduce stress and have an overall improvement on our health. And finally, and this is one that ladies, this is specifically for you, it's good for your lady parts. And what that means is that there's a something that causes yeast infection, right? That lives in the vaginal area. And by having less restrictive on there, so that's why when you wear those, I always say when you wear those tight shorts or panties and certain types of fabrics that don't allow the area to breathe and air out, that's how women, that could be a precursor to yeast infections. Sleeping naked helps that area air out, and then you can reduce the amount of yeast infections potentially in your life. So those are 4 health reasons why sleeping naked can be good and healthy for you. Doc, what are your thoughts?
I'm just going to take your word for it. I think there are 2 people involved in this whole scenario. So I had to run these by somebody that I know, to see what they think about these rationales. So I think that it's an interesting subject, obviously something people have not talked about. You've taken the program to a whole new level, and I appreciate that. So, but I think that people might want to try it. In my house, my wife believes the temperature should be that of Antarctica. So sleeping naked, might be a little bit more difficult in this particular household. But
she could be regulating the temperature, because when you put on those clothes and have those blankets, as the article shows, is that you're raising your temperature and your body is trying to cool itself. So she might be lowering the temperature in the house in order to cool herself down even more. And so by sleeping naked, she wouldn't have to put the temperature on Antarctica, because her body would be cooling as it normally is, or as it's trying to do.
Well, I'm going to run that by her a little later after she had a couple of drinks. See what she has to say about it, but I think it's a good piece. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, you want to be a nurse. So what we're going to hear from is a super nurse, Dr. Paulina Van. She's going to tell you about her experiences and some of the challenges you may face. So if you want to be a nurse, stay tuned right after this break.
Several years ago, when former County Commissioner Addie Green was diagnosed with breast cancer, she initially kept it quiet, but eventually it came out.
It ended up on newspapers, television, radio, CNN. I had people who were serving the legislature with me calling me.
But now Addie believes that not talking about the disease may actually be harmful.
When they hear of they call it the C word, cancer, they really think that that's a death sentence. And I think we need to make sure that our women of color are being tested early.
The statistics are shocking. The 5-year survival rate for white women who have had breast cancer is 95%, compared to 63% for African Americans.
The fact that our incidence is 17% lower than, non-Hispanic whites, but our mortality is 34% higher. So that really struck me.
Scientists suspect that the more aggressive cancer, known as triple-negative cancer, may be the problem.
With the new breast cancers that were being diagnosed, that 16% of those new cancers were this triple negative in non-Hispanic whites versus 82% in African Americans.
Dr. Randall and Addie Green both have the same advice for African American women.
You've got to go and have a mammogram.
All right, welcome back to the Black Health Now with Doc and Dane. Nursing is a tremendous career. Right now, there's a shortage of nurses, and it looks like there's going to be a shortage for quite some time. Those of you who want to be a nurse, obviously, you're going to have to be tough. You're going to have to understand what's required. So who better to speak to this about this than a super nurse. Dr. Paulina Van.
And so it begins in high school and the admission process. You're required to have a strong science and math and writing background, because nursing school is quite rigorous in all those areas. Those subjects form the foundation for a successful nursing school journey. And so if young Black students, male and female, tend not to be mentored to take the sciences, to take the math, to really focus on writing. And so when it's time to apply for nursing school, they tend not to be prepared or ready. Or if they get into nursing school, it's the same challenge. So that's, it starts from high school. And then during the application process, that narrative that you write about why you want to become a nurse is very critical, because your application is representing you to the institution. And so our African-American males and females don't tend to be mentored in that way as well. And then getting into nursing school, there tend to be very few other students that look like you or me, and so we may be excluded from study groups. There may be examples given during class that are offensive to us. So it's just a continual struggle. The other is that patients may say, I don't want that African-American student taking care of me. So these are things that happened 50 years ago, and these are things that are happening today.
What would you say to young people who are facing this situation? What was obviously the thing was you had to speak up. What are some of the other things that they need to know about dealing with, which even in this day and age is obvious discrimination in front of them?
Okay. And so it's a great question, Dr. Lenore, because I really believe, and I'm going from my experience and how I've mentored other African-American students and students of color, that it first starts with yourself. You have to believe in yourself. You have to know that you are just as qualified, just as good as anyone else pursuing a nursing career or in a nursing career. The other thing that was very, very instrumental to me is having a mentor. Some of them volunteered to be my mentor because they saw my drive. Others I sought out. And I'm here to say that fortunately or unfortunately, that when I look at my mentors, none of them were African American. And so I'm just asking you to reach out to mentors of all races, of all areas of specialty. And they don't necessarily have to be a nurse. They may be someone who majors in English. It may be a business person, but reach out to mentors that will help you along the way and navigate and socialize you to being a student, because they're peer mentors, or being a professional working in healthcare, working in business, or working in whichever field you choose.
All right, Alice, thanks to Dr. Van. Her experience is really somewhat unique. She has not only encountered all of the things that young people are going to encounter, but she has succeeded in a whole nother level. And so consequently, I think her advice is certainly very welcome to those of you who are early on in your careers or who are thinking about being a nurse in high school or college. I think listening to what she has to say can be very valuable.
I think, and I would just implore people that if you want to get into healthcare, and we know doctors are at the top of the food chain, but there is a much needed, there's a great need for nurses in society today, in particular and it was exposed during the pandemic. So there's a need for nurses, and there's a big need for nurses of color. So if you're considering getting into healthcare, nursing is a great profession. You know, Doc, as we were talking about, getting more people of color into nursing, the whole kind of concept of race comes into play. And we have an interesting interview that we're going to do tonight talking about the role that race plays in science and science research. And so I think it's important for everybody to pay attention to the role that race plays and how that can impact your health and wellness.
Well, Allison, I didn't anticipate that this was ever going to be a problem, because we know that for cradle to grave, Black people suffer disproportionately from a number of illnesses. And I always thought that would be something that the research community would take fairly seriously. I think they started to ride the horse of social determinants of health as a solution to every problem that we have. But I want to know, why is there such a controversy? We know that if you're Black or you self-describe as Black, your outcomes are worse. Who better to talk to, Ellis, than Dr. Esteban Bouchard? Dr. Bouchard is a distinguished professor of pharmacology, one of the youngest in the nation. He comes from the streets of San Francisco. I mean, literally from the streets of San Francisco into the scientific community. And he has an interesting story to tell, which we will explore sometime next week on the Wellness Watch. But for purposes of this discussion, let's get into a discussion with him on the issue of race in research. Dr. Esteban Bouchard is a professor of pharmacology, the youngest endowed chair at the University of California, San Francisco. Welcome to our program, Dr. Bouchard.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lenore.
I never thought that this would ever happen. Can you sum up the story? What's the controversy here? And how do we get to a point where a lot of medical schools are no longer using race as a research criteria?
Well, as you know, with the murder of George Floyd and many others in the last couple of years, race has boiled to a tipping point in the United States and around the world. And there's been increased social politicization of race. And rather than confront the issue head on, many of our large medical institutions have decided to bury the whole idea of race and exclude race and ethnicity from clinical decision-making processes, which we have used for years and years and years.
What do you think? What is to sum up the controversy? I mean, how could race not be a part of the solution?
Well, it's very clear that there are racial differences in disease risk, outcomes, and that's been very well documented, especially within the United States. Part of that is due to social determinants of health, but part of that are due to probably biologic factors, including genetics and epigenetics, that get in under our skin and change the way our body physiology works.
Yeah. So, but genetics. We were thinking always that if you self-describe as African American, you really don't know what you're talking about, really, in terms of how you're made up genetically. That's a truism. So what's wrong with saying, okay, if you describe yourself as self-described African American, and you may not be that may not be the bigger part of you, or if you take a drug or you counter a situation, that it may be a part of you that's not Black. What do you say to that argument?
Well, it's actually quite complex. Self-identified race, ethnicity is very important, but it's also what others view you as. For example, what do the police view you as when they pull you over? But on a biologic or medical level, it also matters what your genetic ancestry is. So, for example, President Obama is always going to be considered African American, yet in reality, he's half African and half European. And that's going to influence your genetic and biologic risk factors for disease.
So what's the argument against that?
Well, many people don't like to talk about race. And so the default now has become to ignore race or become race neutral when trying to make clinical decisions. And I argue and advocate that that's the incorrect move to make.
what are you saying? I mean, they say, well, you know, if you can't tell from looking at a person exactly what the genetic makeup is or how they may respond genetically to something else, what good is it?
Well, we're at the point of science where we can actually genetically measure your ancestry with a simple saliva test. And that's what many of the big companies are doing now. But medicine has gotten politicized where we want to go backwards in time instead of forward with advances in medicine and science.
Explain.
So we can precisely estimate your genetic ancestry, and we can actually estimate the ancestry of, say, a particular gene. Doesn't matter if that's your insulin gene, you're African, European, or Native American. And scientists like me will say, yes, it does matter. And we have demonstrated, we and other scientific members of our community have demonstrated it's very important. But many people refuse to believe that science has advanced that much, and it's easier to close our eyes than confront the challenges.
But if you say a whole community, this is the Black community, and the Black community is not doing well with diabetes or hypertension. You can't go around taking genetic tests of everybody in the Black community. I mean, so obviously is the Black community kind of an institution that needs to be studied somewhat differently from the way it's been studied in order to justify using race?
Yes, I would argue that we need to, number one, include diversity in all of our clinical and biomedical research. It's been pretty well documented that worldwide, out of modern advances of genetics, non-whites have been included in less than 4% of modern genetic studies. Although Europeans make up about 16% of the world, they actually dominate 96% of all modern genetic studies to date. And that means that a large swath of the world population is missing out on the benefits of precision medicine, advances in genetics, and advances in science.
Well, you know, this is a controversy that's still somewhat up in the air. It seems from my perspective, that it's a losing battle. And more universities are kind of gathering around to say that race is an unnecessary artificial discriminatory classification. And I agree as you do. There must be some reason why Black communities do worse. So if they do worse, maybe we need to consider them as a community from a different way of targeting for precision interventions. But Dr. Esteban Bouchard, thank God we have you on our side, because there are not very many people who have the training and the expertise you do, and we appreciate you. So thank you very much. Yeah, so Ellis, I'm telling you, this is a very hot topic. I mean, they don't have much trouble, identifying us when we walk down the street. I don't understand why they wouldn't want to take a community. I think the other side of that is that if we don't know the specific genetics of who you are, how we're going to target the medicines. And so consequently, it may distract us. But I think this is an argument that's up in the air. And we want people to join us on the Wellness Watch when you get into this with more detail with Dr. Esteban Bouchard.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's an interesting discussion, and I'm glad we're having it. And we need to continue to have these type of discussions, because you're absolutely right, and I think Dr. Esteban is absolutely right. We cannot dissect race from how we're treated in any endeavor in life, from work to social to healthcare. And if we try to do that, whatever the intentions are, and I'm not trying to ascribe any negative intentions to those that are trying to erase or dissect race from this, but I do think that it's problematic, and you cannot dissect or erase a personal bias. And everybody has those biases, and those biases about race have been built in for centuries. And so to just think that automatically we're going to eliminate that in an entire industry where people are shaped by their environments, I think that is a bit naive to think that we can do that. So, Doc, you had an interesting interview with a neurologist, which is always fun to see a Black neurologist, and talking about memory and memory loss. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that interview and set it up?
Well, Black neurologists are pretty rare, man, no question about it. Here's Dr. Charles Wyndon. He is the chief of the Aging and Memory Center at UCSF. You know, when we always think that when older people, you know, I don't include myself in that group, but I'm close. Older people don't remember things. That's the way it's supposed to be.
Right.
Being senile is just what's supposed to happen as you get older. Well, senile is a more difficult concept than you think. And Dr. Wyndon explains to us the difference between being senile or being demented as opposed to the special diseases that he deals with, like Alzheimer's. Let's listen to what Dr. Wyndon has to say.
We, with the advancements that have been made in the science of understanding dementia, Alzheimer's, and other conditions that cause memory and thinking changes, have really come to understand that dementia itself is very different from Alzheimer's disease. So I'll try to explain it in a way that makes sense. Dementia just simply refers to a decline, meaning a change in memory, thinking, other abilities, such that somebody is no longer able to take care of themselves independently. That's all that dementia means, okay? In contrast to that, Alzheimer's actually refers to a process that is occurring in the brain itself. So in Alzheimer's disease, what you actually have is you have a buildup of two types of proteins in the brain, amyloid and tau. And they start to build up in inappropriate amounts. So you have a big buildup of these proteins, and we know they're not supposed to be in the brain in those amounts. Very often, people who have Alzheimer's develop dementia because having these proteins building up in the brain often leads to things like memory loss and changes in thinking. But again, trying to really emphasize the point that they're different, you can have Alzheimer's disease and not have dementia. I have a number of folks I take care of who have Alzheimer's disease in the brain. We've done the tests that have shown they have these proteins in the brain, but they don't have dementia. They're still driving. They're still actually working in some capacity. They're still doing a lot of things they need to do to take care of themselves independently. In contrast, there are folks I take care of who have dementia, but they do not have Alzheimer's disease. So they can no longer take care of themselves because their memory and their thinking has gotten very poor. But when we do the special test to look for Alzheimer's disease in the brain, they do not actually have presence of Alzheimer's disease. So again, really important to understand dementia, Alzheimer's, they're separate. Very often somebody who has Alzheimer's can develop dementia, but that doesn't always have to be the case. So we have to understand and think of them as separate, but there is a bit of a link.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wyndon. It's very important, Ellis, that we understand that when people start forgetting things, there may be a lot of other things wrong. Could have had a stroke. They could have had a lot of other issues. They could have Alzheimer's. And so it's more than just the fact that, well, he's just old. Every time I forget my keys, my children panic. He forgot his keys. He don't know where his keys are. You know, and so consequently, they don't remember half the stuff I told them growing up. How they expect me to remember where my keys are all the time. But I do think it's important to have people like him in the mix to understand and explain these issues and to fight for us to get the kind of resources the Black community needs to deal with these problems.
Well,
So-
it's fantastic. I think we have to recognize what our thresholds are. And so there is a natural kind of erosion of memory that can happen, but I think there's a threshold that pushes it into something that's more pathological. So we have to recognize what those thresholds are. So it's okay for you to lose your keys. It's not okay for you to forget where you live.
Right, or where I've been. You know, right. I want to forget some of the places I've been, but yeah, you're right. Well, let's now turn to the final piece of our program today. You know, I've got a lot of kids running around my office, and the parents will come to me and say, he has ADHD. Often it's the parents that have they're hypoactive, and their children are normally active. And many doctors and many people want to put them immediately on ADHD medicine. What's even more important and more troubling is the number of college students that come to me and say, I got ADHD, I can't really focus in college, I need medicine. And so I'm the one that puts the lock on that. Self-limiting, we don't prescribe for that. So tell us, what you can do if you've got active children without medications.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting discussion because some parents don't want to put their kids on medication, especially younger children. And so when we're talking about ADHD, and we've known that since the 80s, there has been an explosion in terms of the number of children that have been diagnosed with ADHD. And we're recognizing that the hyperactive, the superactive, the kid that may not be doing well in school, but you know that they're bright, it's good that there's a diagnosis. And so once there's a diagnosis, we can lay out a treatment plan, but also we have to figure out what type of plan we want to, and do we want to put a younger child on medication? If you don't, there are alternatives. And so tonight we're going to talk about a few of the alternatives. And if you have a child that is distributing or has been diagnosed with ADHD, but you don't want to put them on medication, I'm going to give you a few ideas on how to, treat their ADHD without medication. So I just want to say real quick, contrary to popular belief, children with ADHD are often gifted. So I want you to recognize that your child still might be gifted, but because of the challenges that are presented by ADHD, they can, not reach their full potential in terms of their intellectual abilities. And so we have to recognize that. And then if we continue to really bash on them because they're not reaching their potential due to ADHD, then what we could do, what could happen is we could have them anxious and really cause depression in that child because they realize, hey, I can do some great things. I'm just having some challenges that they can't verbalize. So here, number one is all of these different methodologies require planning and consistency. So if you're a parent and you know that you might have some ADHD type tendencies, then you might want to hand this off to somebody else that doesn't. But if you've got the ability, let's talk about these methods. Number one, physical exercise, right? So that is a key because part of ADHD is that H is hyperactivity. And so if they're doing physical exercise, that can calm them down because they're tired. It has a calming effect, and it releases, those neurotransmitters, helps build those neurotransmitters to help them be able to focus more. So physical exercise is a good thing. Number two, mental exercise. And so that can help challenge the attention span, right? So we're talking about attention deficit. That's part of the AD. That's the AD. And so if we do some mental exercises, that can expand it. Typically, this is handled by medical professionals, counselors, and whatnot, or educational professionals. But there are some apps that you can download to your child's device that can help them practice some mental exercises. Number three is mindfulness, right? That mindfulness is being able to calm, because children, and particularly people that suffer from ADHD, like a lot of stimulation, right? And that stimulation can help exacerbate the condition. Even though their mind is craving it, it can make the matters worse because they always want stimulation. And at times they'll be disruptive to create stimulation. If we can teach them mindfulness, to sit down, to be able to relax and calm their spirit down, that can help alleviate some of the ADHD. So yoga is a good thing. Meditation is another thing that your child can practice in order to help them, lower that threshold and need for stimulation. Behavioral therapy. This is done by professionals, but it can assess those non-productive kind of habits of ADHD, and then they can give them, tricks and techniques to overcome those habits that aren't as productive as some of the things that are beneficial from ADHD. One of those things I can tell you, a full disclosure, I suffer from ADHD, and one of the positive things from it is I have the ability to multitask and focus in a situation where there's a lot of stimuli going on. However, organization and things like that are challenges, and so you do need that balance, and behavioral therapy can give you that balance. Coaching. Everybody does some sort of coaching. If you play sports, there are career coaches, there's life coaches, there's a lot of coaches, there's a whole profession of coaching. The one kind of, and this is similar to counseling, but they're not licensed and trained as a counselor. So you do have to kind of weigh the cost benefit of coaching versus taking them to a licensed professional counselor. And finally, diet, nutrition, and sleep. All of these things. We know that there are foods that can exacerbate an ADHD condition. So if you want to know what those foods are, you can always go to blackdoctor.org, and we have a channel dedicated to ADHD, and you can find out those foods. Nutrition, that's a big part of it, and sleep. Getting your required amounts of sleep for children and adults really will help your body regulate itself overnight, get your brain and everything regulated right. So each day you can start fresh and renewed, because we know when we're tired, a tired mind requires much more stimulation to stay active. And that can be a disruption to anybody, particularly a child with ADHD. So those are 6 tips, things that you can do that don't require medication, that can help you if you're an adult suffering with ADHD, and particularly if you're a parent of a child that had ADHD, that will help them in the long term without having the effects of medication.
Ellis, could you mention those 6 things again?
So we're talking about physical exercise, mental exercise, mindfulness, behavioral therapy, coaching, and then finally diet, nutrition, and sleep.
Well, there's a lot of good information. Now, everybody accused me of being hyperactive. I can just tell you a quick story. My teacher called my mother, tell her to come down to the school because I had skipped the 3rd grade, went to the 4th grade. So she told me, your child's all over the classroom. He's hyperactive. So my mother, she didn't have any medicine. She drove me about a block and said, if I have to come back to this school, I'm going to kill you. And that was enough. I didn't need any Ritalin. I didn't need anything. I mean, after that, I just got to calm down and everything went on. We've had an interesting show today. Talked a little bit about a COVID update. We've talked about becoming a nurse. Yeah. We talked about sleeping naked. I'm going to bring that up again later tonight. A little bit on the difference between senility and some of the other things that you might think of. And finally ending with an issue of whether race matters in science and hyperactivity. Now, we're going to be here every week. We're going to be digging it out, Mr. Dean and I, to get the latest information for you in the Black community. Right now, we're the only online Black health news show on the air. So why don't you tell your friends, get your friends to come and look at our program. Give us some suggestions about what makes us better and what you want to hear from us. We go on every week. We're starting on Wednesday. We may move the time around and get a better audience. We do that from time to time, but we do appreciate everything you've done from your research, Mr. Dean, and I appreciate the topics that you've chosen. I
try to find the news that the people can use in their daily life.
If you can't use that news, you can't use news. But in any event, we want to thank you for joining us on this week's edition of Black Health Now with Doc and Dean. It will be every week. Remember, health is your biggest asset.